Mute yourself if you can. Raise your hand if you don't know how to use the signal to be recognized, and Gus and I'll try to recognize you if Charlie doesn't. Go ahead, Charlie.
Okay.
Charlie, you should remind everyone about chat. Some of them got on after we discussed that.
All right, some of the questions I wanted to raise are up on chat now. They're numbered 1 through 4, and some of them have a few sub-questions. But since I don't have a handout here, and I don't want to shift to share the screen so that we can all see each other, I put them up on chat so that they'll be there for reference. So I found this very interesting. It has all the important features of Polanyi's emergentism here in the Duke lecture. Some phrasing struck me as very odd, and going back to this is interesting because I think later on, perhaps when he was doing those conferences at the Boulogne conference and others, where he developed his theory of emergence a little bit more, maybe some of the more subtle distinctions came into play. But we can go back to this and see if I was reading into his later lectures thinking he had sorted some of this out, or if these kind of ideas that seem to blur a little bit continue on later on in the 60s. So he's got the important features here like dual control, where you have a subsidiary base and you have the emergent level, and the emergent level also has control. So whereas the subsidiary base has its laws, like the laws of physics and chemistry, right? An emergent biological organism can order and organize on the marginal level different features of the subsidiaries in order for it to persist, in order for it to act. So it has some control as well as the lower level having some control. So that's here. And he's moving against this whole trend in science and actually in the history of modern philosophy towards analysis towards explicit statements as being the key to knowledge on one side, on the epistemological side. So he's countering that with his idea of tacit knowing and the structure of tacit knowing. And on the other side, he's moving against this idea of reductionism, that what's really real are the smallest parts, right, in the earliest parts. And so the physical and material, so closure of physics, everything reduces down to physics and physical explanations. So he's moving against that too. So I like what he's doing here, and I'm going to raise some questions, some of which came up in some essays that went back and forth. Tihammer isn't here, Margate. He was one of the people that brought up the issue that I'm going to raise first in the first question here. And also Robert Cohen did back at the Colloquium for the Philosophy of Science at BU. He was around during those lectures and conferences in the 60s too. He questioned this idea that Polanyi brings in, and we saw this in the first lecture, that the structure of tacit knowing, and he used the word determines the structure of being, right? So he's taking the structure of knowing and discovery and saying, this is a clue towards understanding that there are comprehensive entities. And we see here in lecture 5, him explicitly making this analogy, a strong analogy between how we know, where we have these tacit clues that come together into joint integration into a comprehensive meaning, right? And in some cases, these come together into a comprehensive entity. And the analogy of subsidiary parts coming together in a system into a whole, and this being a real comprehensive thing, a thing out there in the world. So you have this idea that we have this epistemological structure of tacit knowing, clues to focal meaning, and we have the similar ontological structure moving from parts to emergent thing, right? So the question here is, does he push together the structure of tacit knowing and the structure of emergent being too much, right? And Robert Cohen was on him about this in the 60s, because he said, well, in analytic philosophy, and one of the good things about it is they try to separate out the genetic from the justificatory, how we know something from what something is, right? And you don't want to collapse the two. And it seems that Polanyi might be collapsing how we come to know something with what that thing is. And this is where T. Hammer also said, you know, Polanyi's pushing these two things together. We've got to keep separate the epistemological from the ontological. And Polanyi moves from the epistemological to the ontological. Now, I agreed with T. Hammer in a very, the worst title ever as far as enticing people to read it. I had an essay that I wrote, From Epistemology to Ontology to Epistemontology, right? It doesn't sound very attractive, but I think it's more readable than it sounds. And I agreed with Tiamer that he does this. There's no one-to-one correspondence between clues and parts and comprehensive meaning and comprehensive entity, right? But that there's a deeper sort of interconnection that I'd called epistemontology, where that word determines, where that seems like you're saying, well, our knowing determines what's out there. Well, it does because of the participatory nature of our understanding in experiencing the real world, right? So that there's a deeper level at which epistemology and ontology can't be separated. There are levels at which it can be separated, and if you couldn't separate them, you couldn't have the conception of truth, where you have your concepts and words matching up with facts, right? And either they do, and you have truth, or they don't, and you have a falsehood. So if you push them together too closely, you don't have a distinction between true and false. So that's one issue, and Ellen, I think in the chat already mentioned that was something that she saw as a problem, and we can talk about that a little bit more. A second seems to be, Polanyi sometimes seems to be confusing what Bateson calls the difference between the map and the territory, right? Those structures and things that we use in order to understand what's real and what's real itself. So to say that a problem or a theory is real and that it has even more reality than a cobblestone, right? Because it can manifest in different ways in the future, seems to be, I don't know if it's pushing together too closely the map and the territory, and want to keep some distinctions out there, right? So our strategies in chess, comprehensive entities in the same way that a mind is a comprehensive entity, right? And this leads to two problems, I think. First, it makes it, it floods the world with more real entities than maybe we want to, because it would water down the meaning of the word real for us, basically. If we talked about just a problem as real. I mean, it can bring us to reality, perhaps. And this is where I say the way he talks about things seems a little odd. But do you want to say it is a reality? And I think some of this clears up when he starts talking about dual control, because those sorts of mind-dependent sort of comprehensive entities that he's talking about there might not have the feature of dual control that he talks about as being important for understanding emergent systems, right? So whereas the idea of comprehensive entity comes directly from tacit knowing, when he adds in this idea of dual control, you get an understanding of downward causation, right, where something can affect its subsidiaries as a feature of reality that you might not have when you're talking about mind-dependent entities, right? Like strategies or problems. So he seems to be moving in a direction where he's going to create distinctions there that of some things that get pushed together. Okay, the other thing is kinds of reality. So is he flooding us with too many types, too many real entities? And he talks about depth of reality, right? And one being a deeper, more real, right? But should he also be talking about kinds of realities? And interestingly, he mentions in passing Henri Bergson, right? And he talked about virtuality as opposed to actuality, right? And virtuality was similar. It wasn't not real. It was real, but it wasn't like the tangible sort of reality. So virtuality basically talked about potentialities that for actuality, but that weren't actual. And so I'm wondering, I don't know Bergson too well, and I want to look further at him. I mean, I've come across him, and Deleuze talks about this too. But this idea of virtuality, and maybe we should separate kinds of reality so that these mind-dependent sort of realities we want to call virtuality instead of reality, and the sorts of realities that can exercise some downward causation, we want to talk about those as realities and expand, because Polanyi definitely wants a richer notion of reality than Bergson's virtuality, but should we still try to make some of those distinctions? Okay, so differences in kind rather than differences in depth. And when Polanyi starts talking about emergence, naturally he goes to discussing evolution and life. That is the key point where we start having emergence for Polanyi. A solar system is not an emergent system because you can explain it by its parts and laws, physical laws. But when you get to things like watches, right, that are artifices that have purposes, or you have living systems that want to perpetuate themselves, right, that they have their own intentions, then you have emergent entities. So he moves to the idea of emergent entities and talks about evolution as a hierarchical structure, right? So here he points out, and is Walt here? Okay, because Walt has a lot of criticisms of Polanyi on this point too, where he says that we need another principle, right? We've got the principle of marginal control, but when it comes to life, and the examples he brings out with Dreich and the sea urchins and morphogenesis, and later he'll add in, when he's talking about the structure of life and Essays in Being and Time, he'll bring in Waddington's epigenetic landscape and how these non-physical, non-lower level sorts of causes come in when we're talking about the ontogenesis of an embryo, right, and its development into adulthood, or the way a genetic code functions. And it seems to function by providing information. Information doesn't seem to be something tangible and physical, but it still has a causal effect. So he kind of starts pointing towards causes that aren't lower level physical and chemical causes as drawing out, when you were talking about ontogenesis, the the fertilized egg into its final form, right? Or when we talk about evolution, where the neo-Darwinian picture is not enough for Polanyi because, well, that might work, right? You do have selection and random mutation, but that wouldn't explain the evolution from an amoeba up to a human being. It would explain it just as well if you were talking about a human being developing to an amoeba, right? It doesn't have the idea of a hierarchical structure in it. It just has the idea of random change. So he says you need a new principle for that. And that's where when he talks about ideogenesis. And this idea of ideogenesis, my question there is, does it concede too much to the vitalists, right? There has to be some sort of living principle that that is an addition to the sorts of principles that we can examine in science. So it might be too much of a concession to the vitalists. It also seems to be perhaps too much of a concession to essentialists, because the way he describes it in the Duke lecture here, it has to be something that's in it from the beginning, right? So the principle is there from the beginning, like we have our essences and then they just manifest out from us, right? Well, there are also features that start and manifest when we're in relation to other things, right? In a system. So it can be the way individuals act in a system that creates the principle or field that then starts to draw something forward, right? Like a dynamic attractor. But he wants to, at least at this stage, I don't know if later, he wants to separate the sorts of principles that act on inanimate matter from the principles that act on living things, right? So whereas he talks about telic fields, right? Telic fields seem to work with both. So it seems to be a broader principle than the ideogenesis principle that he has in mind here. But it seems like dynamic systems could work to say, okay, things in relation form attractors, right? Attractor basins, and then things start moving towards that attractor, right? That seems to be the sort of telic explanation that doesn't require a principle that's there from the very beginning. Unless you want to say that, well, it had the potential to do this, which is kind of empty because of course it did, because it happened in the end. So of course it's some, right? But it can unlock different potentialities, and systems can unlock different potentialities. To say that a principle has to be there from the beginning seems to push an essentialist sort of view. And it also seems to move, if there is one telic point in the universe, right, it seems to have this sort of religious aspect, whereas if attractor basins and telic fields develop, well, then things can go off in different direction. You have more of a plurality than a hierarchy. So we can also question whether or not we should be thinking in terms of hierarchy or plurality here as well. Okay, so I think I've gone through my questions, and hopefully I don't know how much of a background people have in understanding Polanyi's specific form of emergentism. I'm hoping that reading the Duke lectures has given you enough to be able to see where these further questions come from. Okay, so with that, you can discuss some of these questions, or we can just go on completely different paths if you want.
Good job, Charles. I want to express my appreciation for the summary of the range of questions that have occurred to you. One thing that relates to one of the first things that you brought out relates to the lecture that I was in charge of, lecture 2. Can you hear me okay?
It's difficult.
We've been having this trouble before, and I was supposed to work on it in the meantime, and I didn't. But in lecture 2, Polanyi, but also lecture 1, he talks about tacit knowing structuring reality in a kind of Husserlian phenomenological kind of way. That is to say, there's a kind of constituting of reality that integrates the participatory aspect, tacit knowing, and it isn't just focused on what later here, particularly in this lecture you're working on. It has to do with the parallel structure between tacit knowing and the structuring of holistic entities. But there, he's trying to get at how it is that tacit knowing engages and leads us to recognize the transcendence of whatever it is that is real, that points to future range of manifestations beyond our ability to anticipate clearly in the present. And that seems to me to involve two different connections between tacit knowing and reality that get more clearly articulated in lecture 2 than I've seen him articulate in any other place. But here in this lecture, we're only, for the most part, talking about the kind of structural parallel between tacit knowing and comprehensive entity.
Yeah, I think they're a lot more intertwined at a more basic level where we experience reality, experience the world through indwelling. Right? Yeah. We're in the world. We're not like a mind out here observing a world out there. Right? We have our bodies are in the world, and we're using our bodies and indwelling them in order to experience what's out there with physical reality. And we've got our minds also indwelling our experience of the world in order to come up with concepts, right, that shape our experience of the world itself. So at this more fundamental level, there's this integration of how we know and what we know. There's this participatory, like you said, how something acts in the world gives us knowledge of it in its reality too. It's how it manifests, you say, right? And this again connects with Peirce and the pragmatists who say, well, how do we know a diamond is real? Well, we know it by its effects, or its the possible effects if we say it is a diamond, right? And so he's moving in that direction that the pragmatists are moving in. And like you say, this is more of a basic level, but when you start pointing out the broad parallels between tacit knowing, clues to comprehension, subsidiary parts, the wholes, that kind of obscures the real tie-in between our knowing and being, because it makes it look like it's just this flat parallel and we're jumping from one to the other. Whereas the determines there at that level doesn't make any sense. It's odd, but determines as in conditions or constitutes our experience of, right? Like in a more basic Kantian sense of intuitions without concepts being blind. Intuitions without, being blind. Then it makes more sense. So it's parallel, but it can be distracting just to focus at the higher level. It can make it look like he's conflating things, and perhaps he does. I forget how to pronounce your name.
Yeah, my name is difficult. It's Sitske, but you can call me Fran. That's fine too.
Fran?
Yes, thank you for giving this talk. I was thinking about Bergson and what you said about this reality and the virtuality and the reality part of it. And I am in these days, I am thinking about virtual reality quite a bit and experiments we have. And I was thinking, is that maybe a kind of junction there, a crossroad? Because and I'm also wondering how would Polanyi would have thought about virtual reality, because we're putting something in reality, but it's not reality as such. So it's a very interesting state. And what you can see, I'm in the field of domestic violence, and we have also virtual realities there, that it changes the awareness of people and gives them different perspectives. So this potentiality is kind of attracted to it, or is kind of focused on it, because something is happening there. And the interesting thing is also you can play with reality in virtual places. So you can do role play. So you can take the perspective, for example, of a perpetrator or of a child of 7 years old. And from these different perspectives, you have new experiences or new insights. How do you think of this? Because that made my mind going when you were talking about this. But how would you think about virtual reality in Bergson's terms and in Polanyian ones?
Yeah, other people can answer too, but I'll give my views. I think virtual reality might be a little ambiguous in this sense, because I think the reality that you create through reconstructing vision, and you're walking in a field now, right? It doesn't have the same sort of potentiality as the real field, right? And other things around you. So it's kind of based on representation rather than the reality that's being represented. But where you talk about virtuality in terms of and I think it gets into this idea that Polanyi talks about understanding another mind, right? And being able to use the clues of the behaviors and the words of someone, or the moves in chess, to understand that mind and to know that mind, right? And this is a sort of comprehensive entity, and that has a reality. He'll want to say it's more than virtuality, right? Because as he says in later lectures, we're our best evidence to the idea that there is emergence, right? We know ourselves as persons, so we know that we don't understand ourselves in terms of just physics and chemistry. But in knowing another mind or another person, we also form a joint comprehension that it seems we can use as a lens to see out into the world. And as such, that strategy in the other mind, or the other mind as we try to reconstruct it, the map as opposed to the territory, I would say, can open up different potentials and possibilities, right? If you try to, well, what would Polanyi say? Well, we're reconstructing his mind and trying to figure out some new thing that might have come out of it. And so when you reconstruct the role of a perpetrator or a victim, or, right, you're doing the same sort of thing. And I think that's a good use of the word virtuality. But it might be a further or different kind than the virtuality of a concept or conception. It seems very similar, though. I can't see everybody, but I see Rain's hand. I think I got to widen my screen to fit everybody.
Thanks, Charles. I really like the question of virtuality and reality, and if Polanyi is diluting the notion of reality, but I'm somewhat skeptical of that, because we want to be careful not to question a reframing or a redefinition simply because we have intuitions about this reality that perhaps are more ontic and more, that just because it's a different sense of reality doesn't mean that it's less suited or less true. And since you mentioned Gregory Bateson, Gregory Bateson completely redefined mind, like the conventional notion of mind. And that was really important for him to talk about his version of systems theory. And so I think some of these redefinitions, that's the question, is it a redefinition that dispels colloquial notions of reality, or is it a redefinition that falls away and fails to answer the question, sort of like the epiphenomenal explanation for consciousness, as if shutting something out and saying it's not real actually shows that it's not real. So I think that there's certainly a different quality to virtual reality rather than tangible reality. And he says the problematique is more real, but the cobblestone is more tangible. Mm-hmm. So my sense is that he wants to establish the hierarchy, but not in a discontinuous way. He wants to say that there is a continuity between the reality of the tangible and then these higher emergent forms of reality.
Yeah, I think that's what he wants to do. And I think that you made some good points, especially about redefinition. And it seems that the conception you have behind your definition makes a difference. And there are metaphysical conceptions at work behind our definition and understanding of reality. That's one of the things he was moving against, right? He said that those people in science who their ideas of trying to reduce explanations, all biological, psychological, sociological explanations, all down to the physical, where the physical sorts of explanations were more basic, right? There you have an idea of epistemology, how you understand things. Also, in what's real, because what's really real are, what's causal and what's causal or physical and chemical. And so by understanding reality in that way, where you can reduce everything down, you're also thinking that you can also reduce down our ordinary sense of reality, and you can't, because that's where we start for Polanyi. It's where we start for the pragmatists. And with real, we're trying to catch certain things. Are we all trying to catch the same sort of things? Are there distinctions that are important that need to qualify reality? So instead of where Polanyi wants to say there are deeper forms, and he's right, tangibility isn't the only criterion for reality. Ability to have an effect, right? To manifest itself in different ways in the future. That's his definition. So he defines it, and he's, of course, changing the definition from prior, and he's similar to a definition from Peirce, who would also talk about what's real as that which has effects, right? And how we understand it is by the kind of effects it has. Is it useful to sort things into virtuality and reality and separate them out? I think there are some important distinctions between I want to say mind-dependent forms of reality and those sorts of reality that are more directly constructed from, influenced by, but subservient to higher controls that are outside of, or we can consider to be outside of, ideas, universals, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think he's pushing these things together, and by pushing these things together, I think he's showing us important things, right? But I don't know if in the end we do still want to make some distinctions there. Also, well, this might be something else, but he seems to be using the word real in existence as a property, as an ordinary property. And that's something that the analytic philosophers moved, I think rightly, to try to show that it wasn't an ordinary property. It's a higher level property. So it's not like something is more yellow or less yellow, right? And does that, it being a higher level property, mean that it's flat and there's only one kind of thing? And maybe then he's right if we adjust for that. Or can there be different kinds of reality, like there can be different kinds of color? But this opens up a lot of questions. But I agree with what you say, that this is what he's doing. And the real test is, does it catch what we want to mean by real?
I see Richard has a question, but I'm going to jump in and ask. The mind-dependent reality is your term, I take it. What would other kinds of realities be dependent on?
Well, I think I just said that, but I haven't thought it through. What occurred to me was, because I reread my paper that responded to T. Hammer last night on and his criticisms, and he makes a distinction between knowledge-like comprehensive entities and I guess material-like or based comprehensive entities. And then he's going to say that he believes like consciousness is sort of a knowledge type entity, and maybe we can't reduce that. Science hasn't found an approach to that. But he's going to say more material-like or based entities, those that machines, dual control, he's going to say that those do reduce, right? Because he believes in the closure of physics. And he's going to say that that Polanyi might be right about knowledge-based realities being separate, right? Or I say knowledge-based, but knowledge-like, and physical-based, more tangible sorts of realities being reduced. So he's going to make that division there and then let one side collapse. When I say knowledge-based, I think what I might be trying to do is talk about different kinds of dependency relations and subsidiaries that might shoot off in different directions. So if you have, this and this, and I spill this on that, do we have one sort of subsidiary relations making a mess or something like that? But if I have different thoughts and different ideas constructing this comprehensive entity of a person, and then I try to understand that, maybe I want to say that there's some sort of difference in kind or quality between that sort of mind-based or dependent sort of entity and a more tangible based entity.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just comment on the mind-dependent stuff and then go on to my more important comment or question. Husserl points out that if I talk about Charles Lowney, I actually talk about you in the exact same way as when I talk about Santa. So somehow, in the way we talk about these things, even though Santa's a mind-dependent reality, I talk about him in the exact same way that I talk about real things. So I don't know what that says. But my question was a little different. I was intrigued by on 20, he makes some statements about the evolution of a single human being isn't explained at all by Darwin theory. And he says we can talk about traits, but it says nothing. And so I reread the sections in Personal Knowledge on probability and the emergence of man. And I just wonder if he's hinting at, and this is part of the problem, is the word evolution, was taken by Spencer and turned into a kind of philosophy of growth and imagination and moving in a direction of more wonderfulness and complexity. But evolution is really just an avalanche of rocks falling down a hill and maybe something happens. You know, evolution is just as much a man rotting, you know, a plant rotting. So I'm wondering if the word even evolution or natural selection is really a probabilistic term. It's just describing probabilities. It's not actually, so when I say smoking causes cancer, smoking really doesn't cause cancer. Smoking is a probabilistic way of associating an activity with a disease. And so when I smoke a pipe, I didn't get cancer, but if my genetics were altered, then I would get cancer. So when we say smoking causes cancer, that's I sound like it's ontological, but really it's just a probabilistic statement. So I wonder if all these things like words like natural selection and, you know, evolution are really just probabilistic statements that don't have real ontology. And that's kind of what he's getting at when so he's saying we need something different to explain it. And I think he's hinting at teleology here. So anyway, that was my thought about, you know, the evolution and, you know, some of the confusion here. So.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And I think he's more than hinting at teleology. I think that, like you said, a man rotting as opposed to something evolving, that's what he says that Darwin can't distinguish, right? It's almost like from a lower level or subsidiary level, we were talking about laws of physics and chemistry, you can't see a machine and its purpose. You can't see a living thing, right? You can't tell whether something's alive or dead unless you use higher order principles, or a machine's working or not unless you use the operational principles. So I think he's trying to say that, you know, by using a Darwinian approach or a neo-Darwinian approach, you're missing something. It's like you're just trying to operate at that lower level and missing higher level sorts of another control, of the dual control, that also selects out and moves, allows us to identify and recognize higher order entities that aren't picked out by the lower level approach. And this is where he says that it's like catching a tiger by catching two tigers and then letting one go. Like that's his kind of, I thought that was very interesting and illuminating in some senses, but then I wonder if it's got a payoff at all in the end. But it's kind of, he's trying to say that if you approach from a population level, the way the Darwinians do, you know, you are getting at something, just like if you talk about the chemical and physical level where you're, you know, when you're talking about a dual control system. But you also aren't explaining the higher order sorts of emergent entity and the processes of emergence by it. You need another principle, he says, and that's going to be where he brings in this ideogenesis, which connects with some sort of telic field that draws something forward and allows us to the ability to, and this is where kind of knowing structures connect in again with ontological structures that allow us to know when something is just a random, you know, malformation or a new species. And so he wants to add another principle there. And part of my question was, do we need another principle? And if we do, is something like dynamic systems approach a sufficient principle for Polanyi to generate something like a telic field without having this hierarchical structure that goes all the way up or all the way down, but just, and then you have more of that plurality, more of that probabilistic or possibilities for emergent entities, and not necessarily saying, well, we've got one here and then this one's up here and then this one's up here, right? Although he wants to say that the more comprehensive the entity, the higher it is. But then if you have a really complex and comprehensive blob, it might be more important or higher or have that more moral superiority to human being, right? So comprehensiveness can't be the only criteria there. I think he's got to import more moral criteria as well. And that's what he starts to do in the end. And he promises he's going to make good on that when he starts talking about responsibility as indicating a further principle of control in this evolutionary hierarchy. Nobody else wants to follow up on.
Well,
Yes,
I
yes.
would,
Oh, Richard.
Yes, immediate answer to this. I brought this up in elsewhere in relation to the English absolutist idealists, in particular Bernard Bosanquet. They maintained that there were humans at a lower level, that a mind is simply a collection of ideas, but for them, the ideas are reality. They are reality. They are the real things. That's the initial bit. It therefore means, as you say, that a more comprehensive collection of ideas is at a higher level than a lower one. This leads to therefore, to the absolute, which is the collection of all ideas, as being the one fundamentally real thing. But it means on a lower level that a state, and this is what Bosanquet says, is a greater collection of ideas that has the same ideas, but there's more of them, there's more beings that have them. They constitute a higher level than the individual. And therefore, the logic of that, of course, is a totalitarian state. But Bosanquet was a liberal and didn't draw the consequence. And I argued that Polanyi's answer is that there is no higher finite level than the person, because the person operates not just by general principles, but by personal judgment, which you cannot get out of by any method, any logic, which is all what the rationalists try to do and all the objectivists try to do. They want to substitute personal judgment by something which is impersonal, like a computer program, an algorithm. Yes, but who creates the algorithm? And who decides whether it is functioning properly? And what's being put in it is not junk in, junk out. Wrongly constructed one means good stuff in, junk out. The same, either way. So that would be the Polanyian answer, that there is an ultimate level, which is the person, because the person is not simply governed by rules. It is personal judgment, own decisions. Lower down, you get that with the more intelligent animals. They judge things. They learn certain things. And they use their judgment, especially predators, and they catch the prey. No, they don't waste their time chasing after it. Kittens chase after butterflies. Cats learn to ignore them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that. That's one point on this. But,
Can we address that first, or is there?
But I've got other points I'd like to make.
Related.
But that's the immediate one.
Okay. I think what you're doing is probably, it might be, I'm letting this unfold, so I haven't read the 5th Duke lecture yet, but it might be more relevant there because he's going to start talking about responsibility.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to figure out we're talking about he's got a hierarchy now. How does that hierarchy unfold? Does it unfold the way Hegel thought the hierarchy unfolded? And I think it's true that, you know, you can say he's got this physical, biological, psychological, sociological, right? And so you've got different ontological levels there that have different principles of understanding an organization, right? Different laws apply to each level. And I think he does get out of it the way Richard does, but I don't think it has to be the highest level. Responsibility doesn't have to be the highest level. Because, you know, in his idea of, and I've been working on his political philosophy finally for a little bit now, and this idea of public freedom, I'm working on a paper for Andrew. He's going to edit this Cuestiones Disputates, and what my essay is I call it 3 freedoms, an emergentist approach to social progress. And the idea is that you have your individual freedom, right? That's the more Humean thing that you were talking about, where we're all chasing around our own individual satisfactions, right? And we have to deal with other people. And then you have an emergent level on top of that, which is the social. And the social itself constitutes a higher order level where there are freedoms society has that it can impose and direct, have, you know, a dual control, like we have control, but the society has control too, that can restrict our freedoms at one level in order for the society as a whole to function, right? And so there's your totalitarianism if you just stop there. But like you've got another movement in the dialectic where now you have an integration of the social and the individual in a form of public freedom where you are free to be responsible, right, to your calling. And this is the higher level. So you don't wind up with the totalitarianism the way you would if you stopped at the social level. You move to that level of responsibility where now you're free in an even deeper and richer sense than you would be if you were just following your pleasures at the bottom level, right? But that doesn't mean there can't be an even higher level in it sort of, if you shift contexts, right? Because he does have this idea of mysticism and the end of personal knowledge, where there might be this joint comprehension of all the incompatibles, right, in this notion of God, and this notion of God or some sort of prime mover or absolute might be the ultimate freedom and the ultimate reality and that sort of thing. So what the hierarchy is the next step after he's establishing that there is emergentism in a hierarchy.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be a monist one, an all-absorbent one, in which the individual disappears. The same is true of Advaita Vedantism in India, the non-dualist the Upanishad.
I agree, and I think that's back to
yeah.
Right. That's just a simple negation as opposed to a Aufhebung or a rising up. I think the rising up has both the individuality and the universality, so it can't just wipe out the individuality. It raises it up in a different form.
Yeah. I think we said enough on that.
I would like to go back to the first question. I'd like to go back to the first question, which I understand really comes out, does Polanyi collapse knowing into being? And what I think, Charlie, you suggested is that this is a question first raised by Robert Cohen, who is a physicist, and more recently by Tiamat Margate, who also happens to have a background in physics. Just anecdotally, I believe the Cohen essay you're referring to appears in Interpretations of Life and Mind, doesn't it?
I think it does. It's been a while, but.
And if I remember, when Green finally showed that to him, he read that, Polanyi read that, and at least the report, he reported that he was delighted by Cohen's perspective.
Cohen's also a neo-Hegelian.
But I think, you know,
or Marxist, I should say.
the question of does Polanyi collapse knowing into being, where I hear you going with your talk of mind dependence is sort of, I think, backsliding, if you don't mind me putting it that way. I think Polanyi doesn't collapse knowing and being, but neither does he allow them to be separated in at least many of the ways they traditionally have. And it is that kind of option that he is really trying to work out with this notion of reality and the indeterminate future manifestations and the difference between tangibility and what we might call richer kinds of, that's the way I would sort of come at this, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, like I said, mind dependent, just that I think that today was probably the first time I said it, and it's got some strengths, I think, to show what some of the subsidiaries are, but some weaknesses because is it getting at something real independent of the mind, right? So not in these lectures apparently, but later on he does talk about we in science, you construct these epistemological, we see theories or comprehensive entities, and then the challenge is to see which one matches up with the world, right? So there's a further sort of tests needed to see if it matches up with the world, then it's just this coherence and brings the clues together in a satisfactory way. To say mind dependent does sound like backsliding because I don't want to say that. I want to say universals are real too, just like Peirce, just like Polanyi, right? And to say, well, they're mind dependent in the context of regular philosophy makes it sound like that they're just constructs. But mind dependent may be our avenue to discovering them in a way, rather than so dependent. We'd have to think about that word. That might not be the best way to phrase it. Otherwise, it does sound like backsliding. You're right. Yeah, and this whole idea of mind and Bateson, I like that, and I'm going to be working on Bateson a little bit more. I promised a chapter for a book on Bateson, so I want to explore this idea of information and cybernetics and his understanding of mind and how mind is if you have a Bateson understanding of mind, saying mind dependent may not be as much backsliding as it is if you're, in the analytic tradition. So we'll see. But point taken.
Can I also say something about your sort of leading to dynamic systems theory? You're always interested in that, Charlie, and I think that's a good connection. And I'm not sure that I understand exactly enough of it to know exactly what you're suggesting, but I would remind you that, of course, the Belgian fellow who won the Nobel Prize, Prigogine, shows up at the 1968, I think it is, meeting in which all these questions about biology come back in the study group in Austin. And he wrote an essay, really, which is just the exposition of what basic dynamic systems theory is about the kind of thermodynamics. And that's the first essay in the Festschrift called Interpretations of Life and Mind, which that group gave to Michael Polanyi, and he was there. And of course, there's some references in personal knowledge to what that Belgian research group was up to before they ever kind of worked out the details of this. So my suspicion is that he would have been quite interested in this kind of development in science.
Yeah, whether or not he thought it was sufficient as acting as a principle for his notion of ideogenesis is kind of the question there. Whether he received it and said, this is what I've been looking for, or he heard it and he said, well, that might explain part of it, but not all of it. I'd like to know the answer to that. Yeah.
Can I make a quick comment?
Sure.
I think some of you are still stuck with the Aristotelian scholastic ontology of substance and qualities. Surely, in the modern world, from physics upwards, the proper terminology is one of activities, of doing, phases of doing, types of action. To be is to be active. As many people, not only Whitehead, but many others have said, there's no such thing as a mind, let alone mind in the abstract, the idealists were fond of talking about. No, what you have are intelligent beings who have mental powers. The ontology we want is Locke's third type quality, which is the real one, which he calls powers, which is the ignored one. And that gives us the answer. Physical powers, we have mental powers. We have other powers as well. But it's of active agents in the world. That should be the fundamentals of ontology. And that brings in the Polanyi's idea of reality as that which surprises us. Why? Because it is active in new ways. It's Austin Power, an English philosopher and theologian, pointed out. We can know something only insofar as we interact with it. We do something with it. We look at it, we see it, we smell it, we touch it, we kick it. We can only know something. If we can't interact with it, either on our side or its side, then we can't know it. So that's another way. Also, Max Scheler had an interest in the American pragmatists. Yet he was a fundamental opponent of any attempt to belittle or simply give a utilitarian view of pure knowledge. But he was interested in the American pragmatists because it can't challenge him with his idea of the mark of reality was resistance. If something resists us, we know we are real. We have too much talk about sight, about seeing, not doing. That's another great fault in philosophy through the ages, dominated by sight, not by. There's no question of an external world for children in the first place and for the blind. They know it by touching and hearing. And that solves a lot of problems, pseudo problems. Sorry, I'm going to.
Yeah, I think trying to reformulate or understand in different ways what real is and not think of it in terms of substance and properties.
No, properties, yes, because properties are chemical properties of what things do.
But properties of what?
Of properties of elements, molecules, and so on.
Okay, those, see, that gets us back to
they are what they do.
Language and logic and how those things are connected, because in using language, we go towards objects and relations, objects and properties. I mean, properties are one place, relations. So yes. we move to that right away. Our logic is basically pushing us in that direction. Our language is pushing us in that direction. I don't know if, but I like, as far as acts go, then now you're talking about more relations, and maybe these objects are clusters of relations or something like that, or instead of substances.
Well, you've got to have you can't just have a relation. You've got to have a relation between two terms.
You can't have
And
what? An agent?
You can't have you can't simply have a relation. A relation has got to have terms.
Right.
X has got to be related to Y.
Right.
With
Right.
people, persons, X can be the term and relation. I can hate myself.
Right.
I can be proud of myself. The French, as we all know, are very fond of doing things for themselves.
We think of relations in terms of centers.
You see. So we have relations to ourselves. Facts do. They clean themselves, unlike dogs.
But I think that can move us too quickly towards an object and properties, or objects and relations sort of understanding. So maybe you're not questioning that, you're just questioning Aristotle's formulation of it. But I would say that I don't know if Polanyi gets us out of that or not. I think we know something through, like you say, we kick it, we it has its manifestations, and that for some, right, that just shows that is it, right? And I think this was something that might have sounded weird to people at the beginning of the lecture. Where was it? The false assumption that we start acquiring knowledge of a mind by observing the workings of the mind in themselves. Right? That might sound odd because it seems like we're acquiring knowledge of the mind by observing its workings, its manifestations in different areas. And so why is he saying that that's a problem, right? And it's because I think he's going back to Ryle, although he doesn't mention Ryle, where they try to cut out this idea that there's a thing that has these properties or relations, that you have to point back to it, that what you're seeing when you see somebody say something or do something, that is their mind. There's nothing in addition that's producing that's a property of. Polanyi's saying, no, there's a center that those actions are clues towards, right? You use these as clues to see that center. He's going to call it an active center later on. Here he just talks about it being a center. So we're not seeing the mind when we see people's behaviors. We're seeing clues to the mind. So the mind is something behind those things that we see. It's not just what we see, it's that, and that has potentialities. It's not just going, it has the potentiality to manifest in a way we haven't experienced yet. And Peirce moves to this too, when people say, well, a diamond isn't real unless you scratch it on something. Now you know it's a diamond. You say, no, we know it has the potentiality to have hardness and that quality, because if we did scrape it against something, it would leave a mark, right? So yeah, I think it does lead to a lot of important philosophical questions surrounding objects and relations or properties, and whether or not we do get at basic objects, or all we have are these activities. And I think that goes back to Aristotle too, because for him, we are because we do. Right? A sleeping person is not virtuous. You have to exercise the virtues in order to be virtuous. That our doings make us be.
Right? Yet Passmore once said that a power which is not exercised isn't a power. To which I gave the example of the atomic bomb.
Mm-hmm. Good example.
Only one head of government in history has unleashed atomic bomb in anger. since Truman's day, many others have had those powers. Unfortunately for the rest of us, none has unleashed such a weapon in anger, only for testing, or perhaps making a threat, as with North Korea. They've had the power to press the button or to order the button to be pressed. But they've never had it, but they've had the power. And I could argue in the British Constitution that many powers of the monarch, although they haven't been used or exercised by prime ministers over the years, for many years, are latent. In any emergency, they would. The monarch is the last defender of the Constitution. And to do that would exercise old powers no one exercised for a long time, such as vetoing acts of parliament. If you had a radical, anti-liberal, anti-constitutional government passing unconstitutional legislation, it was still there. It's still there to be used by the monarch.
Okay.
I'd like to go to a question that you raised, Charlie, that I don't know that we've addressed fully. In your chat, this is fairly far down the list. Does Polanyi essentially make too much of a concession to what is called vitalism? And I take it that you connect this with his interest in idiogenesis. When Polanyi was writing these Duke lectures, the New Synthesis was, of course, much more in control, wasn't it? And vitalism was a dirty word. But what's happened in philosophical biology is there quite a different attitude about the people who used to be called vitalist. And some of those people no longer seem to be forbidden, you know. And I'm trying to think about, well, what's going on in philosophical biology that in some ways seems to be linked to the kinds of things that Michael Polanyi was saying some time ago. And I know that you read more in philosophical biology than I do, so I'll just leave it at that.
I don't know how much I've read lately, but I just, in saying that, I was thinking that this idea that there had to be a special principle from the beginning that is specific to life, that caused life to be out of inanimate nature. And I think you can talk about higher order principles, then yes, there are principles of life that organize life, that just like operational principles organize machines that are higher than the physical and the chemical. But the idea that you need something that's entirely different to draw life out of the universe. And I'm wondering, because here he talks about it can't be the same sort of thing as an inanimate principle, right? That it has to be specific to life, but earlier already present in, I guess, the inanimate, because he believes that life emerged from the inanimate. And when I talk about the principle, the dynamic systems, I'm thinking in terms of something that spans both life and inanimate systems, right? Because we can talk about connectionism and computer programs that have dynamic attractors and produce results that model language and things like that. So it's probably not as bad a word, especially if you're not thinking like the early biologists, where they had physics envy, right, that we talked about earlier. And the physicists had mathematics envy, right? And so they all tried to kind of bracket out their higher level concepts in order to try to express what they were doing, what they discovered, just in terms of physics and chemistry and not in terms of purposes, right? But purposes have always been endemic to life, endemic to biology. And so whether or not you're being dishonest, as Polanyi indicates, right? He says, no, we got to talk about purposes if we're talking about this. And our understanding of emergent entities, the higher order concepts, are necessarily involved even when we're trying to explain things in terms of lower order causes, right? In order to understand what a part of a frog is and how it works, we have to understand a frog first, right? As example of frogs earlier. So vitalism, I guess it doesn't have to have the bad connotations that it had, but that you need something new is a real question, right? That there are different principles that evolve, I think is unquestionable, especially if you believe that there are emergent systems. But whether or not you need a principle of life there from the beginning that's generating everything, or a principle at the very end, a telic principle that's drawing everything forward. Those are two more open questions. Richard?
I may. Surely principles, laws are not entities, let alone
I
active
agree.
ones. And
Polanyi
this
seems
is
to question that sometimes, though.
this is the whole problem with Polanyi. Even more so with Daniel Pasky, whose 2-volume book I've read and tried to review, or at least parts of it.
I'm due to review that in the spring, so we'll see.
Yes,
I haven't read it yet.
It'll be in the next issue of Appraisal when I've put it together. Just waiting for a few more things. Cista, you contributed to it years ago. I'd like to see you back again. Okay. The point is this: laws of nature are simply human codifications or articulations of regularities in nature. They do not do anything. It is active agents, atoms, molecules, bats, dogs, volcanoes, the lot. They are active, they do things. Principles and laws don't. And in effect, in personal knowledge, though I haven't got the page at hand, what he has to, he's so determined to avoid any divine, any theistic involvement, any way of opening to God, so he's determined to do that he makes these higher principles enact themselves.
Makes them what?
Pasky to enact themselves. They bring themselves into being in order to bring higher levels into being. That is what he says in personal knowledge, which you haven't got to yet. And it's not in this. That's the fundamental problem. According to his own principle, that the lower order cannot explain the higher. It cannot generate the higher.
Right.
That's his own principle, but he ignores it, its implications. Pasky goes to better. He hypothesizes space and time, especially time. Time does things. Time doesn't exist. Change exists. If there's no change, there's no time. Change exists. There are times. Well, if you have changes, space doesn't exist. There's only spaces between and among physical objects. no physical objects, no space. One physical object and no space because it's got nothing to take a space with. You need at least two. Because there's nothing for it to move to or around and so on. So this is again a fundamental problem. This is why I've ceased to believe in emergence.
Wow.
Because it cannot be explained by any intramundane explanation on Polanyi's own very principles. You end up by using the old sense of evolution, which was that of the tree from the seed, the oak from the acorn. But to get it, that's no good. It's already in there. And that is what people like Collingwood, in an unpublished work of his, well, most of it's unpublished, Jan Smuts, Bergson with his Elan Vital, Collingwood had Nisus. They put everything back into the beginning as if it was, as you said, already there. But as Pascal admits, life presupposes life. He admits that. The origin of life, macro emergence, cannot be explained. You have to, on intramundane principles.
All right,
there's
so
lots.
you're bringing up a lot here, and you say this is leading you not to believe in emergence.
Yeah, because it has to be it can only come from outside. I mean,
Can only come from outside.
from outside, extra mundane.
Extra mundane. Now, I
Nothing
think
in the world can explain how the world came into existence, can cause the world to come into existence. It can only necessarily points to something beyond.
so. The alternative to emergence is theology, basically.
Theism, not deism.
All right, so you're saying the middle alternative between reductive science and theism, which would be emergentism, is not viable. And it's because, by Polanyi's own admission, the lower level principles do not explain higher order emergent activities. So they have to be explained by something extra mundane, something outside entirely.
I mean, the worst example I've come across is Stephen Hawkins, in his last book, states that the principle of gravity brought the world into existence. Well, gravity, a force, can't exist unless there is some forceful entity.
Yeah. Well,
He says the law of gravity.
I think that's.
I mean,
I think
are forced
principles
into utter rubbish. These people, simply because they cannot accept logic.
I think one way to approach it that might say we don't need something outside is to say that, that there are those principles, right? The higher principles, you say, where do they come into being if not from the lower? Well, that's a metaphysical leap. That's saying that anything that is actual has to come into being, or real has to come into being from something that's earlier. Otherwise, where can it get its reality from? That's Descartes, right? And that goes back to Aristotle too. That's a metaphysical assumption. The idea that perhaps interactions at the lower level can produce regularities that then can sustain themselves by and then reflect, right, in their operations. Not that the principles are real, but they are the map of the territory. And maybe Polanyi mistakes map and territory here, but those principles that the systems that allow them to sustain themselves, right, those are emergent, those are real. Where do they come from? Well, chance, but the potentiality for being stabilized in some way. And now there's a stabilization, so we say that emergent is real, and maybe something builds off that, or something builds off that, or another one is over here. So I think it can still get emergentism without going outside the system if you're saying that whatever's there has potentialities that fall into place through some sort of systemic relations that start to sustain themselves, and then we have this emergent entity, this comprehensive entity.
But that begs the question of
We have reached the end of our appointed time.
sorry. Yeah, sorry.
I guess
apologize.
people can leave. I still want to hear what his response is, so I'm going to hang.
Okay, well, just as long as, go ahead, Richard, hurry.
But my response is you are putting everything back into the beginning. It's the game. It's the seed becoming the oak. The ankle becoming the oak. It's all potentially in there.
That I think is just a way of looking at it. That's a backwards way of looking at it. That thinks it must have been there at the beginning. We talked about. Well, I mentioned this a little bit earlier as my question about whether or not Polanyi is being too essentialist, right? By saying this has to be right there at the beginning in order for anything to happen. The very idea of emergentism is that there are real things that aren't there right at the beginning, but that come into being because of those other things that are already there, forming certain relations.
But that is the point. That is precisely the problem. If it has the potential, potentiality is like a system can be unlocked by a random event, but it's already got to be there. And the point here is that it can't, the principles can't be there because principles are nothing, are not agents. All that can be there are the elements, and the elements and the compounds they form.
I agree the principles aren't there, but to say something has potentiality, I think...
yes, but what brings it out, you see? What brings it out of that?
This again, an essentialist idea. If we have this idea of, going to Wittgenstein and language games and things like that, and where there are organization contexts, and in that context, you say that this thing is real. That doesn't mean it existed before the context of relations somehow, and then it walked into the context, and now people can use it. It's like it develops its identity, as a comprehensive entity in the context. So again, I think Polanyi's way of mixing the map and the territory, I think, lead more easily to the conclusions that you're drawing from it. Because then you can say, well, these principles are real, but how can those real principles be there at the beginning, right? But if we're not talking about principles as something separate from the system and relations of operation that could be there at the beginning, but something that emerges and becomes there, and now we think of it in terms of a principle because we see its actions. We don't reify that and say that has to be there at the beginning anymore.
To talk about potentiality is one thing. It can be shaped. Inanimate matter can be shaped by life. Agreed. But life's got to be there to shape it. Life presumes life.
There's the solar system, and there are other elements and things like that. But I think the shaping can arise by maybe even accident. That maybe doesn't have to be a telic cause that's out there way in the distant future, but an accidental sort of formation of things can maintain a shape and maintain an identity, and then perhaps act on its constituents in a way and have some form of downward causation where it can continue to maintain itself by eating, right? Or continue to maintain itself by affecting its subsidiaries.
Yeah, well,
and then we have emergence. It's not that it was there from the beginning. It just happened, and
that's no explanation. It's like
well, it's not an explanation in terms of principles. It's an explanation in terms of genesis, I suppose.
Yeah, he explains emergence by it happens slowly. No amount of more of the same bring in something new, radically new.
Right. It's not more of the same if something interacts with something that never did before, right? If there's an instability and randomness are required in order for there to be emergence.
Yes, but there's something else needs to be there. Something which is the agent.
Is that a real explanation, though?
But all you're doing is describing what has appeared to have happened. Once there was very little, very nothing. The elements got sorted out from hydrogen and
very
so
high entropy.
Yes, and so on. At some point, life comes into existence. Is inanimate, can produce something animate. You've got to have something else, which is radical. That's the whole point.
Well, this is a point of vitalism,
all these
right?
systems, all these attempted systems, but not only come up against a lot of empirical evidence regarding, but also against this logical point.
We have agreed that an hour and a half is.
Yes,
I'm enjoying this, though. This is.
Well, you and Richard can carry it on for sure.
No, I've got things to do. Sorry about monopolizing it, but yeah. It's more for the next week.
Next week is the last one, and Walt Gulick will be the facilitator. So see you next week.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
thank you.
Oh, can I add one further point? Tia Mayor.
Oh yeah.
Tia Mayor's name is Tia Mayor Margaret Toy. A is R. A is R. A with an acute is R. So it's Tia Mayor. Mayor. Margaret Toy. I know very little Hungarian, but I can just about get my tongue around it.
Yeah, I guess I've never said it right.
And there's in another context a difference between European pronunciation of the one of the leading phenomenologists and the American one. Over here we say Husserl. Over in America, you appear to say something like Husserl.
Husserl.
Yeah. No, well, we say, and the Germans say, Husserl. But never mind.
Richard, to the point that you were making earlier with your exchange with Charles about the personal knowledge and the lack of your belief in emergence and everything, I think essentially that your earlier discussion and characterization of that is essentially where Gödel got. He ended up a theist at the end too for a lot of the same arguments. Gödel ends up at the same position you were describing earlier. He ends up a theist too.
Yes.
For some of the same reasons you were outlining.
Sorry, who is that? Somebody I don't know.
This is Eric Howard. I was referring to Kurt Gödel.
Kurt Gödel. I haven't heard of him.
Gödel?
Yeah.
Gödel.
Yeah. Thank you, Charles.
G-O umlaut.
Yes.
E-E-L.
E-E.
I was just giving a practical application of of Richard's pronunciation discussion right there.
But what was the what's his publication, please?
It's all in personal knowledge. It's all over there. Polanyi's already come across it.
Oh yes, sorry, yes. Yeah, I've forgotten. Yes.
Carl Sigmund's book does a good job of outlining a lot of that stuff too.
Yeah.
Well,
a lot of references have been suggested in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I haven't looked at the chat.
And I believe that shows up in the recording, which it takes Zoom a little while to process it, but I'll be sending out that in the next couple of days. So you may want to look at that. So.
Okay,
Thanks,
good,
Charles. Thanks, Gus. Thanks,
good
Phil.
day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Guy, for
Yes,
for your
we'll
work.
see you next week.
Yes.
So
All right.
Cheerio. Bye.
Bye.
Leave meeting.